Welcome, everyone. Again, I'm Yanis Miaulis. I'm president and director of the Museum of Science. And between my laryngitis and my British accent, you probably won't understand a word I have to say to you tonight. So I have invited my fellow boss to introduce the chairman, the speaker tonight, Rick Burns. I hope you'll understand his English better than you'll understand mine today. I hope that he'll do a good job. Tonight we're honoring the 41st recipient of the Bradford Washburn Award. This award celebrates the continuing legacy of former director and dear friend Brad Washburn by recognizing an individual who has made an outstanding contribution toward public understanding of science and the vital role it plays in all our lives. I was in Washington, D.C. yesterday, believe it or not, giving 2 keynote speeches with this particular voice. And one of them was in front of the director of the National Science Foundation, who then came over and he said, "Do you know that great director you had for many, many years?" I said, "Brad Washburn." He said, "Yes." And he went on and on and on. He knew everything. Barbara, he knew everything about Brad, the director of NSF, everything about Brad. So it was very, very nice to do again. Brad always comes up in all events. You bet it did, you know. I already exchanged 5 emails mentioning Brad already to the director of NSF. Yes, we're like this now with the director of, yes. Well, unfortunately, Brad is unable to be with us tonight, although he knows about the event and he wanted really to come, but he's not here tonight. And I want to say how much I admire his energy and his inspiration, even at 96 years old. But of course, one of my favorite gals, his wife, lovely Barbara, is here, and their daughter Betsy is here. Yes. And Ned are here, Betsy's husband. Where is Betsy and Ned? I saw them. There they are. There they are. Thank you all so much for coming. The Washburn Award was established in 1964 in honor of Brad's 25th year as a director by a trustee who wished to remain anonymous. The spirit of this award reflects Brad's commitment to excellence and to the Museum of Science, a commitment that has inspired so many of us to be here tonight. Dr. Carl Sagan, Jane Goodall, Waddell Cronkite, Jacques Cousteau, and Sally Ride are just a few of our distinguished past recipients. And Paula Aspel, a good friend who is here tonight, I just said hi to her before. Is Paula here? Is another one of our distinguished recipients, the 1994 recipient. This diverse group of women and men share one important quality, a passion for science and the importance of sharing that passion with the world. This year's recipient certainly carries on that tradition. And I got to tell you a little story, since it's my thing to tell little stories before Rick takes over to introduce our distinguished recipient. David Suzuki, Dr. David Suzuki, who was the recipient, he is a distinguished scientist, researcher, and environmentalist. And I knew that. The thing I found out about, last week, Thanksgiving weekend, is my in-laws invited all their kids and grandkids. They paid for all of us to spend the weekend, the Thanksgiving weekend, south to celebrate the 50th anniversary. So Beth was asking me, what book should I bring? So I said, well, we're giving an award to Dr. Suzuki. I have some great books here. Well, let's take some books to read. So here we're at the beach, believe it or not, we're at the beach last week. Here's snowing. And she opened the book and started reading the book. She said, he's amazing. And not only he's amazing, he's a great fisherman. And I'm a passionate fisherman. So Beth kept on and on the whole weekend where everybody learned about Dr. Suzuki. But today when I met David, I told him, you're a fisherman. Well, you would imagine 2 scientists, researchers sort of talk about the world and things. All we talked about is different kinds of bait and lures they use. And what crashed me is I told them the story where last week I caught this enormous fish out of a boat, a huge fish. It took me half an hour to bring it up. And finally it came up, and it was the crew's responsibility to bring it in. And Beth went on the side and said, "Oh my God, you haven't seen anything that big." And the fish left. And when I told David the story, I was hoping you would say, after all this fishing camaraderie, "Oh, gee, that stinks, that's awful." He said, "Good, fish like that, big like that, should go on and live their lives, you know." So, so with this, I want to introduce the chairman of the board, Rick Burns, to introduce tonight's recipient.
Good evening, and I would like to welcome you all. It's fun to see so many new and different faces here tonight. And I don't have a fish story, actually. I'm just going to introduce David. Tonight we honor an individual whose accomplishments span science, broadcasting, journalism, environmentalism, and human rights. Dr. David Suzuki has made his life's work to translate the complexity of science and the relationship to nature into stories that speak to people of all ages and all educational levels. He has used his experience as an environmentalist and groundbreaking geneticist to raise scientific and social issues on radio and television. By demystifying science, he has enabled the general public to understand the potential impact of the most powerful forces shaping their lives today. He teaches us all that the input of an informed public is critical to wise decisions being made about the direction our society will take. First and foremost, a scientist with degrees in biology and zoology, as well as a teacher, lecturer, and writer, Dr. Suzuki has received consistently high acclaim for his 30 years of award-winning work in broadcasting, whether on the long-running popular science program Quirks and Quarks, through mini-series and specials on PBS, the Discovery Channel, or as host of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's popular program, The Nature of Things with David Suzuki, which is currently broadcast in more than 30 countries around the world. He has raised the public understanding of all things scientific. On radio, on television, in countless newspaper columns, and over 40 books, through public speaking engagements, too numerous to mention, this prolific communicator has influenced ordinary adults and children, as well as prime ministers and presidents. An environmental activist, he has made a positive impact on the planet, speaking out on issues such as oil drilling, logging, nuclear testing, and green space on preservation. And one of the things that I learned about in reading about him was that the Prime Minister of Canada said that it was his efforts that were really responsible for Canada signing the Kyoto protocols. He had... Often, by producing a television program or writing an article or a book on an issue, he has been able to raise its visibility on an international scale. A third-generation Canadian of Japanese origin, David Suzuki was uprooted at the age of 6 and interred in a remote valley of the Rocky Mountains during World War II. The experience fueled his love of nature and his commitment to fighting injustice and bigotry. A compelling voice for civil rights, he has fought for the rights of First Nations in Canada, Indigenous people across the globe, African Americans, Japanese Canadians, gay, and Jewish people. His pioneering research in genetics and the realization that genetics had been misused in the 20th century programs in Canada, the United States, and Nazi Germany has led him to write and speak extensively about the social and ethical ramifications of genetics, genetic engineering, and cloning. Feeling the pressure of being one man faced with so many critical environmental issues, in 1989, Dr. Suzuki and his wife, Dr. Clara Cullis, convened 13 activists to discuss the formation of a new organization that would focus on the world's ecological crisis. Out of the 3-day retreat, the David Suzuki Foundation was born. The foundation goes beyond responding to the symptoms of global imbalance and seeks to discover the underlying root causes of environmental destruction, analyze the best scientific evidence available, and communicate the analysis and solutions to scientists and the population at large. The organization has since grown to a staff of over 40 people, as well as hundreds of volunteers. The foundation has actively sought elder participants whose perspective and knowledge has often been marginalized in modern society, and has also incorporated the ideas of young people in programming. The success and visibility of the foundation have brought greater voice to David Suzuki's ideas and influence around the world. Dr. Suzuki embodies the essence of the Bradford Washburn Award. He is an individual who has made and continues to make outstanding contributions towards the public understanding of science, its importance, its fascination, and the vital role it plays in all of our lives. David, would you please join me at the podium? The writing on here says, accomplished geneticist, esteemed professor, prolific author, highly respected broadcaster, tireless activist, you have taught fearlessly in the global classroom on such complex issues as genetic engineering and sustainable ecology. You have infused your books, newspaper columns, and television and radio programs not only with your scientific knowledge and wisdom, but also with your spirit and your values. Your influence, once limited to the research lab, now extends from Sesame Street to the United Nations. You have also established the David Suzuki Foundation to continue your lifelong commitment to fight injustice, bigotry, to safeguard our planet, to educate, educate, and educate. Thank you. We honor you. Dennis?
David, it is a great honor to present you with a Bradford Washburn Gold Medal. Please accept also this check of $10,000 as a tangible evidence of our high esteem. Medal. And Rick and Barbara, if you would you like to come here, we'll take a picture. And they will let us know. What do you like us to say?
Are we supposed to bite it to see?
It's chocolate. Yeah, that's good. And now it's my pleasure to present to you the 2006 Bradford Washburn Award honoree, David Suzuki.
Thank you. Thank you. Far too many kind words said. I've just completed a rather grueling book tour with the last book I intend to ever write in my life. It's my autobiography. And what it really was a celebration or a thank you for all of the people that have made my life possible. And I'd like to just begin my remarks by saying people like me don't just suddenly explode into celebrity or visibility because we're so terrific. You know, there's just countless people that have worked their hearts out without ever asking for recognition or credit for anything, and they are what make people like me possible. I had a very, very important lesson in the early 1970s when I was just starting as a host of a program called Science Magazine, and I was still an active scientist, a geneticist, and I found this television stuff very, very agonizingly slow and boring. Anyway, we were filming in a lab in New Orleans, and I was sitting on a stool, and I had to just sit there, and the lighting man comes in and sets the lights up, and that's very time-consuming, taking light readings, and the sound man comes and mics you up and tests your sound on his machine. Then the camera assistant sets up the tripod and the camera, and finally the cameraman, Rudy Kovanec, comes in like this king, you know, and he then comes up to my nose with a light meter, takes the reading, goes back to the camera and adjusts the focus, comes up again, goes back. He does this 6 or 7 times. Nothing's changed, but he's still doing. So finally I said, Rudy, for God's sake, shoot the bloody thing. And my boss, Jim Murray, grabbed me by the shoulder and he pulled me in a room and closed the door. He said, listen, Suzuki, everybody in that room is busting their ass to make you look good, and that's not easy. I kind of crept back into the room because I realized instantly he was right. I mean, all those guys are working their hearts out, doing what their job is. And at the end of it, it's shot, it's edited, it runs on air. Nobody says, wow, wasn't the lighting great in that show? Or did you hear the sound? They all say, it wasn't Suzuki great. And I get credit for what all those people do. And that's what I would certainly like to acknowledge here, that all those things that you said about me, believe me, there are dozens and dozens of people, especially my wife to begin with, who've made me and what I've done possible. Thank you very much for this great honor. When I look at the list of past recipients, I'm just quite overwhelmed to be joining this group, and I'm thrilled that Paula Apsel is here, and I'm thrilled that many of old friends have come. Thank you for coming at my invitation. And John Banks, where are you? John Banks, I'm very proud to see a board member of our foundation is here too. Thanks for coming tonight. At the risk of being incredibly presumptuous, what I would like to do is share a bit of basically my life and the tortuous path that I've taken to becoming a popularizer of science. We call it popularizer in English. In French, it's much more appropriate. They called it vulgarisation. Vulgarize the science. I was born in Vancouver in 1936. And both of my parents were born in Vancouver, my dad in 1909 and my mother in 1911. In the months following the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, though we were Canadian-born citizens who had never been to Japan, we were stripped of all rights of citizenship, our property was confiscated, and we were incarcerated in camps deep in the Rocky Mountains for 3 years. In 1945, as the war was coming to an end, British Columbia saw a way of getting rid of its yellow peril problem, at least half of us, Japanese, by giving us a choice. We could sign up and renounce our citizenship and get a one-way ticket to Japan, or we would get out of the province and go east of the Rockies. Now, there were 22,000 Japanese Canadians who were shipped out of the coast and incarcerated. Most of them were Canadian citizens, most by naturalization, not by birth. They were so pissed off at the government that over 95% of them signed up to leave Canada and go back to Japan. My mother's mother and father signed up. They were on the first boat that left Vancouver. They were dumped off in Hiroshima, and both of them were dead in less than 9 months. My parents said, we've never been to Japan. That's a foreign country. We're staying. And so we ended up growing up in Ontario. Pearl Harbor and our subsequent evacuation from the West Coast, our incarceration in camps and expulsion from the province, were the defining events in my life, shaping my psychological hang-ups and saddling me with a lifelong concern about civil rights, a lifelong hatred of ever looking at myself on air or on camera. I was watching an old show of mine the other night with my wife, and she said, you know, every time your face comes on air, you turn away. I didn't realize that, but I just don't like the way I look. And a lifelong drive to prove to my fellow Canadians that I'm a worthwhile human being. I believe that my job as a result of those years in the camp, my job is to remind Canadians that democracy sounds great. When you use the words, it sounds great, but you never get enough of it. You always have to get more. And all of the rights and guarantees that democracy claims to give us, equality before the law, freedom to associate and move and speak, all of those things are easy to guarantee when times are tough. The only time they matter is when times are tough. And if you can't guarantee them then, there's no point in calling yourself a democracy. And I believe that that Canada and the United States failed miserably that test of what a democracy is in 1941. And now, after 9/11, when I look at what's happening in both of our countries and the fear that there are people within us who look different, who may have different religions and worshiping habits, and I see that kind of suspicion that was tossed at us after World War II began. And I just want to remind you, democracy, you never get enough of it. If we're going to ram it down the throats of other people, we damn well better live it ourselves right here. I was very, very fortunate. My dad was an avid gardener, and he was an avid camper and fisherman. The first memories I have from childhood are on fishing trips with my father. And that was a beginning of a bonding with the natural world that has lasted for me all my life. And my mother was a typical Japanese-Canadian woman. She was first one up in the morning, the last to go to bed at night, worked her heart out for the family, but was always in the background, very shy. My dad was the outspoken one. Everybody loved my dad. He loved to talk. But my mother gave me the greatest gift. I discovered when I was about 9 a swamp near our house. And every chance I could get, I'd jump on my bike and go to that swamp. I'd walk in with my shoes and pants right into the swamp with a little net and a bottle and dipping things out. When I came home, covered in mud and soaking wet, my mother never, ever said, "Don't come in the house, you'll dirty the floor." She would welcome me in. I'd drip all over the floor. She'd strip my clothes off. And she acted as if everything I had in those jars was the most amazing discovery. I remember when I brought home salamander eggs, well, she just about went nuts. And I thought I was going to win a Nobel Prize. It was just my mother encouraged me, and it hurts me when I see young couples today in their spanking clean houses in the city, and their kids come in with a bottle of caterpillars or beetles, and right away the response is, "Take that out of the house, don't bring it in here." And we teach our children to fear or have disgust for nature. And I've always been grateful to my mother that she never did that. We ended up in southern Ontario in 1945, where my mother and father worked as laborers on a fruit farm. And we had lost everything during the war. So we were taught, my sisters and I were taught, that education and hard work were the keys to escaping our poverty. My dad always said, "You want to succeed in Canada, you got to work twice as hard as a white person." Fortunately, that wasn't very hard. But Dad, my father also did something very, very, that I've always been grateful to. My dad always believed that in order to succeed in Canada, you had to be able to get up on your feet and speak extemporaneously and present yourself in a forceful way. And he always felt that Asians suffered an impediment of being so shy and self-effacing, and we'd get up and mumble and stumble, and he said, "You're not going to go anywhere if you do that." And so he made me, in the 1950s, oratorical contests were all the rage. And he made me go into public speaking contests. And it was agony. I'd have to write my speech out. And then every night after dinner, I'd go down the basement with my dad, and I'd have to orate. If I missed a word or stumbled on a phrase, I'd have to start at the beginning. Or if he stopped me and said, "Look, that's an important word, you have to emphasize that." Or if he said, "You should gesture at this," I'd go back to the beginning. And so I was going back. By the end of the evening, every night, I'd be crying in rage. But boy, I won a lot of public speaking contests. And my father gave me that great gift of oratory that was so useful in my career as a teacher. I did well as a student in high school in the 1950s. And back in those days, if you got good grades, you were called a brain. And if you were a brain, it was the equivalent of having syphilis. I mean, it was terrible, right? Because you know that high school is divided into two groups. There's the innies and the outies. And the innies play basketball, football, hockey, they're cheerleaders, and they're the beautiful people that set the... And then the outies are everybody else, the brains and kids that sing in glee club, drama club, debate club. Those are all the outies. And those are the gang that I hung up with, but I was fortunate in that I had enough of an academic record to be offered a scholarship at Amherst College in Massachusetts. And Amherst was the greatest part of my education, and I'm eternally grateful to America that they offered me that position. Because Amherst College had the attitude that foreign students were a huge asset to the education of American students, that we brought perspectives and experiences that American students could benefit from by listening to. So they valued us, and they gave me a scholarship that was worth more than my father earned in a year, which is a fabulous amount of money. In 1954, that was $1,500 a year. But thanks to Amherst and that scholarship, I got an education I couldn't get in Canada. And it fills me with shame that today I belong to a university, the University of British Columbia, that recruits students from Asia, not because they value the perspective that they offer, but because we're gouging them and charging them top dollar in order to increase revenues in the university. And it just fills me with shame that a rich country like Canada would be doing that to foreign students. When I left for Amherst in 1954, I was living in a city called London, Ontario, 100,000 people. There was no television station anywhere in London. And the only people with TV sets had giant antennae on their houses, and they'd intercept the snowy images that we captured from Cleveland or Detroit. So I never watched TV before I went away to university. And of course, in college and in graduate school, I was too busy studying to watch television. So I bought my first TV set in 1962 when I was hired as an assistant professor of genetics at the University of Alberta. And I was just too ambitious in science then to be worried. I mean, my wife watched TV, but I didn't watch any TV. But the university in 1962, this is amazing, University of Alberta had a program called Your University Speaks, and it was on at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning. I'm sure it had an audience of 4 people. And it was terrible. It was unbelievably boring. But anyway, somebody heard that I was a good lecturer, and they asked if I would do a show on genetics, which is just stand up in front of a slide and talk. And I did, and they loved it, and they asked me to do another and another, and I ended up doing my first television series of 8 programs. And it was a very important thing because I realized that I wasn't afraid or freaked out by the camera, and I seemed to have a knack to take very arcane scientific ideas and make them presentable. And the reason is, all through school, when my dad came home at night, he'd say, "What'd you learn in school today?" And I used to tell him what I learned, and if I told him something he didn't understand, he got mad as hell at me. "What do you mean? I love you, you're trying to explain it to me? Don't start using all that term. Explain it so I can understand it." So even to this day, when I go on television, I think I'm talking to my dad. And man, he'd give me hell if he doesn't understand it. So that was important. After I'd done a couple of these programs on Your University Speaks, I would come on campus and people began to stop me and say, "Hey, I saw your show last week. I thought it was great." And my response was always, "What the hell are you doing watching television at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning?" And it just didn't make sense to me. But I realized then, wow, this is a very powerful medium. And it planted a seed in my head that television is a potential way of educating people. Just as I was beginning my career in science at the University of Alberta, I was a hotshot. I wanted to become famous as a geneticist. A woman came along and completely sidetracked me. Now that's happened to me ever since puberty, but in this case, I've been ever grateful to her. I never met her, one of my greatest regrets, but she had as great an influence on my life as any woman I've ever known. Her name was Rachel Carson. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring. And as I read the book, it was as if she had written it for me. And the message I read was, you scientists are clever. You can invent chemicals like DDT. You can show that it kills insects and doesn't harm plants. But you forget the lab or a growth chamber is not the real world. So you spray out in the real world where everything is connected to everything else, and you end up affecting fish and birds and human beings. And that's when I realized I had always assumed that the lab, whether it's a growth chamber or a test tube or a flask, was essentially a miniature world. And so you study that miniature world, and then you extrapolate from what you do in the lab to the real world. But what Rachel Carson said is, when you look at a part of nature, you remove it from the context within which it exists. You lose sight of the rhythms and the cycles and the patterns that make that part interesting in the first place. What you are studying in the lab is an artifact. It's got nothing to do with the real world. And you can't extrapolate from the studies that you do in the lab out there because we don't know enough. And for me, that book set me then. I continued my scientific career, but it pulled me into the whole environmental movement in 1962. And I'm ashamed to say that most of my colleagues in genetics and biotechnology today haven't got the message that was in Silent Spring. So they think you can do all of these fancy experiments in the lab, flip genes from one organism to another, and then anticipate what the consequences of growing genetically engineered trees out in the open or releasing genetically engineered salmon into the ocean will be. They haven't read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Thanks to her, I was pulled into the real world. In British Columbia, the very first issue I got involved in the mid-60s was the American plan to test underground nuclear weapons in Amchitka, a part of the Aleutian Islands. And Americans weren't any different then than you are now. You didn't care what Canadians felt. You went and blew them up anyway. But one consequence of that was that Greenpeace was born in Vancouver. A lot of Canadians don't even know that Greenpeace was a made-in-Canada group, of which many of us are very, very proud. And we were fighting against drilling for oil off Hecate Strait in the ocean, and we stopped that, and we stopped a dam on the Peace River at Site C. Now we've got a right-wing government. Guess what? We're fighting drilling for oil in Hecate Strait 30 years later, and the dam at Site C. So the terrible aspect of environmental issues is you live to fight them over and over again. You don't, the victories are temporary, and every defeat is forever. Students in my genetics courses, I moved after a year. In Edmonton, it was 40 below for a month. You can't imagine what a temperature at 40 below is like. Humans should not have to live at that temperature. So I was fortunate, a job came up at UBC in Vancouver. I applied and was accepted, and I went to UBC and immediately began to teach big courses, lots of pre-meds, and they began to ask me questions about the implications of cloning and genetic engineering and animal breeding and eugenics and race and intelligence. Even though I'd had this fantastic education at Amherst and then University of Chicago, I wasn't prepared to answer those questions. I hadn't been taught those things. And so I had to go to the library and begin to read. And to my horror, I discovered this terrible intersection between two passions of my life, the fight for civil rights and genetics. And I discovered that geneticists early in the 20th century, so delighted, intoxicated by the discoveries being made in this infant area, began to make extrapolations to human heredity and behavior and intelligence. Eugenics, a discipline devoted to the improvement of the human genome or gene pool, arose and was populated not by third or fourth rate scientists, by some of the top geneticists in the United States. They had their own scientific journals. They taught eugenics courses in universities. They had scientific meetings. It was a legitimate area of study. Eugenics. One of the leading eugenicists was a man named Edward East, professor at Harvard. He was president of the Genetic Society of America, and he had a eugenics text, and right in the preface of his text, he says, and I quote, "In reality, the Negro is inferior to the white. This is not conjecture or supposition, but a crude statement of scientific fact. Inferior or superior, good or bad, are not scientifically meaningful terms. These are value judgments. And as so often happened, scientists confused their own personal biases and beliefs with what was demonstrated or corroborated by science. Often extrapolating from the inheritance of physical traits in other animals, scientists made pronouncements about heredity and intelligence, about drunkenness and lewdness and laziness and a host of other behavioral traits. Such claims were not inconsequential. In the United States and in Canada, eugenics acts enabled states and provinces to sterilize inmates in mental institutions. The rationale was a genetic basis, but we didn't know enough about human heredity to even say what were hereditary problems in mental institutions. But we sterilized in Canada hundreds and hundreds of people. Several states passed anti-miscegenation laws prohibiting interracial marriage because of what were claimed to be disharmonious combinations. Immigration laws were skewed in the United States against races deemed to be inferior. And to my horror, I discovered the justification of the Japanese-American and Japanese-Canadian evacuation had been based on genetics. Once a Jap, always a Jap, no matter how many generations of birth in the United States, was the way John DeWitt, the general who carried out the evacuation in the States, put it. And in Nazi Germany, race purification laws that ultimately led to the Holocaust had been trumpeted and by geneticists and supported and based on genetic principles. It was a revulsion against the discovery of the Nazi death camps that led geneticists finally to reject the notion that nature played such a huge role in human heredity and behavior. So after the war, then, there was a complete shift to say, oh, no, it's all environmental. Now, of course, with the DNA work that's going on, we're coming back to where nature is now thought to be the driving force of human behavior. And I won't go into that. It's a whole nother speech. But most of it is bunkum. But because scientists confuse causation and correlation, and they're very, very different. But I don't want to get into that. What I realized as I began to read to answer my students' questions was that science had enormous social ramifications. And in my way of thinking, the best way to avoid the misuse or the deleterious use of science was to ensure that the public understood what was going on in science and had some understanding of the implications for society and the economy and everything else. And that's why I chose to become involved in television. I was an active science in the 1960s and 70s, but I was often asked to do a book review on science or do a comment on some new discovery or some science story. So I began to do little stories here and there. And in 1968, I did my first national television. It was a program. It was called Suzuki on Science. Scientists hated it because in 1968, I had just come back from teaching at Berkeley, and my hair was down to my shoulders, and I had a headband with granny glasses. And the scientists hated the fact that I was a scientist, but I looked like a hippie. But it got quite a cult following among young people, and so the program did very well. And basically, it was, I would travel and interview scientists. It was a half-hour talk show, but I interviewed, I think I interviewed John Beckwith for the show. Certainly, I interviewed a lot of Nobel Prize winners, Carl Sagan, and many, many scientists, and Renato Del Becco. It was a great show. I chose to go into television in a very serious way because I believed it was such a powerful educative tool. But now that I've spent so much of my life in television, I'm not nearly as hopeful about the prospects for television. Even in 1962, we referred to television as the boob tube. And I thought that the television offering, even back then, was a cesspool. But I thought my shows are going to glisten like jewels, and people would reach in and pluck my shows and savor them. Well, what I discovered is when you jump into a cesspool, you look like a turd like everybody else. And the reason is It's true. The reason is that I thought, you see, I never watched television. So I thought what people do is they look at the TV guide and they go, oh, The Nature of Things is on at 8 tonight. Oh, boy, I can't wait. 8 o'clock comes, you turn it on, and for an hour you go, shh, don't say anything now. You know, and then at 9 o'clock you turn it off and say, well, what do you think? Should we write the Prime Minister? Like, that's what I thought people did with, well, of course, that's not the way people watch TV at all. They turn it on when they come home, and yeah, they even watch it while they're eating, and we're distracted. You know, the dog needs to be let out, and you go for a beer, you go to the bathroom, kids need to be put, I mean, all kinds of things interrupt your time. So you kind of tune in and out. Well, by the time we go to bed at night, our brains are mush. We can't remember whether it was on The Nature of Things or That's Incredible. It's all just mushed up in there. And in the early 1970s, I was on a noon-hour talk show called The Bob McLean Show. And in the interview, Bob McLean said, so Dr. Suzuki, what do you think the world will be like in 100 years? And I guess he wanted me to say there'll be cars whizzing through the air and robots will do all the housework. But anyway, I said, well, you know, if humans are still around in 100 years, I think they'll curse us for two things, nuclear power and television. So he completely ignored the fact that I had said we might not be around in 100 years. He ignored the nuclear thing and said, television, why television? And I said, Bob, you've just asked a really hard question. If I were to say to you, gee, that's a tough question, I'll have to think about that, and proceeded to think for 10 seconds, I said, you would cut away to a commercial in less than 3 seconds, because television cannot stand dead air. And that's the problem, is there is no profundity in television. It's all just so many jolts per minute. Thinking back on that, not a bad answer off the top of my head. But I can amplify on that response I had way back in the 1970s. We now live in Canada in a multi-channel universe, where in any city you can get between 70 and 100 channels. And when you're armed now with a remote control, it means I watch my daughters go click, click, click. I mean, so fast, I have no idea what they've gone by. And when they click onto The Nature of Things, then what do we have to? We have to reach out, grab them by the throat and say, don't you dare move. How do you do that? You shout, you're louder, you're more sexy, you're more sensational, you're more violent. It's not an accident that we've done shows recently on psychopaths, that we've done shows on female castration, that the last blockbuster rating we got was a show called Fallacies, spelled P-H-A-L-L, on the penis. We're all in there trying to capture audiences. The pernicious aspect is this. In 1992, we were doing a show on the Earth Summit in Rio. Now, The Nature of Things was an hour program then. And I decided we better look at the Nature of Things show we did in 1972 when it was a half-hour program, when we did it on the Stockholm Conference, the first United Nations Environmental Conference held. Well, to my amazement, in a half-hour show, there were 2 interviews with Margaret Mead and Paul Ehrlich that lasted 3 to 4 minutes each. Today, we're an hour program. We would never run an on-camera interview longer than 30 seconds. And you know what? When I watched those 3 and 4 minute interviews with Mead and Ehrlich, I kept thinking, oh God, this is boring. Like, my expectations have sped up, and I demand it in shorter and shorter bullets as well. So something happens to us as we have half-second shots on The Nature of Things now, and it changes us. I always worried that virtual reality, which was coming in the 80s and 90s, was dangerous because virtual reality is better than reality, that we'd prefer to be in virtual reality. You can have the kinkiest sex going and not worry about AIDS or getting caught. You could have a drag race and have a crash and walk away, or have a gunfight at OK Corral, get shot and still survive. I mean, virtual reality is better than the real thing. You get all the heart-thumping jolts of adrenaline, but there's no price to be paid. And I thought my shows are different. You know, we're showing nature and all its glory, and people will fall in love. But I realized I'm doing it. In television, we do virtual reality nature shows. We send a guy down to the Amazon to film. I don't go down there for 6 months. This poor guy's sitting there blind for 6 months, trying to get the most sensational shots. And when he comes back with them, we edit them all together. You get a shot of parrots, and then a shot of of some jaguar, and then a shot of natives. And of course you think, oh my God, the Amazon looks wonderful. If you take a boat and go down to the Amazon and expect things, nothing's happening. Most of the action is up in the canopy, 100 feet above ground, or at night. What we do is we edit together a version of nature on steroids. You're getting it bam, 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 bam like that. And that's what we're leading people to expect. Nature needs time. Nature needs time to unveil her secrets. And we're not willing to give her the time. And I think that does very, very bad things in our expectations of the natural world. In the area of conservation, the message we're getting out is be careful, go slow, save for tomorrow. Think holistically, think long term. The message implicit in television is exactly the opposite. It's all about instant. We want to know instantly about everything. They're little packages. We don't think holistically at all. You just get little shots of information. We don't think at all long term, because it's all got to be relevant stuff now. And the underlying message of all of it is buy, buy, buy. So television itself as a medium that I thought would educate people turns out to, in fact, counter the very message that I was trying to get across. I chose to go into television because I felt it was important for the public to be scientifically literate. And as I say, I had an ability to get scientific ideas across, accessible to the public. I thought that my role was to transmit the information to the public, that the public is empowered with knowledge. And with that knowledge, they would go out and make better decisions. To my amazement, that's not what happened in my involvement with television. You see, television's a very ephemeral medium. You put it on air, it goes on at a specific time, and if someone's not there to watch it, it's gone. And as I say, we tune in and out, we don't watch it. And over time, people don't remember what each show was all about in detail. They say, oh yeah, Suzuki did that show on dams. Yeah, I like that show. And over time, what they remember is that funny-looking guy hosting the show. Yeah, and they trust me. That's why they watch the show. The show has credibility, they trust me. And to my amazement, although it's stupid that I didn't realize this at the time, rather than me empowering them, they have empowered me. When I call the CEO of a company in Canada or the Prime Minister's office, the chances are very high I'll get a return call within an hour. Not because I'm so important, but because they know 1.5 million to 2 million Canadians watch my program, and they take that very, very seriously. So that's what's a very heavy responsibility that the public has laid on my shoulders. I'm sorry, I've gone on too long, but let me just conclude. In the 1970s, a group of us who were interested in science and society did a survey in Ottawa of members of Parliament. And we found that over 70% of our elected representatives, and I suspect it'll be the same in Washington, come from two areas. They come from business or they come from law. Now, I think it's probably because those are two areas where people can afford to run for office and lose. But anyway, they're overwhelmingly, we have representation from business and law. We then gave a very simple test for comprehension of scientific and technological terms and principles. I mean, this is something you give a grade 6 class. And guess what? The people who scored absolutely rock bottom were business people and lawyers. So we are now electing people who are going to have to make decisions about what to do about global warming, about nanotechnology, about biotechnology, about space research, about intelligent machines and missile defense systems and deforestation and depletion of oceans, and I could go on and on. How can we make informed, wise decisions on these issues if we are scientifically illiterate? We can't even, our elected representatives can't even assess the information that's gleaned by their advisors. The most powerful force shaping our lives today is science. Science when applied by industry, medicine, and the military. And yet if you look at the amount of space devoted to science compared to issues of celebrity, to issues of politics, of business, or sports, you'd have to conclude science is a trivial aspect of our lives by the amount of space devoted to them. When I was a boy, my mother and dad wouldn't let me go to movies in the summer or swimming in pools, in public pools in the summer because they were terrified I might get polio. Children today have no idea what a terror polio was at one time. When I was a boy, my mother and father, of course, never worried that I was watching too much television or surfing the net too much because there was no television or there were no computers when I was a child. When I was a boy, each year hundreds of thousands of people around the world died or were terribly scarred by smallpox. Hasn't been a single case of smallpox on the planet for over 20 years. When I was a boy, there were no jet planes. There were no transoceanic phone calls. There were no satellites. There were no birth control pills, organ transplants. I could go down a list that is literally feet long. Each of these things, the result of science and technology, changes the way we live. Indeed, in many cases, changes the very definition of what it is to be human. And they render the old ways extinct because we never go backwards. How we are out of control over these important forces if the people that we elect to office are scientifically illiterate. Today, the president of the most powerful, wealthy nation on earth, a Yale graduate, a Harvard graduate, continues to reject the advice of the National Academy of Sciences, the most eminent body of scientists in the United States, who for over 20 years have been telling us that global warming that is caused by humans represents a threat far greater than terrorism that required immediate action. And yet your president has consistently rejected this. Rejected the reality of global warming and the reality of the need to do anything. That fact alone stands as a reflection of the abject failure of our educational system. And I also feel that we as scientists have fundamentally failed to convey the importance of science as a part of what it is to be a responsible citizen in our countries today. So this is the challenge I believe that we face. The scientific community, certainly from my experience, and I'm sure Carl Sagan would say the same, and Margaret Mead and Paul Ehrlich, who've been in the area of communication, would tell you that much of the difficulty of being a communicator of science is the scientific community itself, who want their representatives. They don't want a vulgar presentation of science. They don't want to approach areas that might be controversial. They only want the proper boosters of science to get out there. It's a very lonely and difficult job to be a popularizer of science if you're a scientist. And I think it's long past time when the scientific community, not because, I mean, I'm an old fart, I'm out of it now, not because of me, but when we begin to start funding and supporting the best among us to go out and be those communicators. And we have to make science a part of every child's education from kindergarten to grade 12. It's a huge challenge. We've got a long way to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. This was just wonderful, really wonderful. Really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for joining us this evening, and in particular you and your distinguished guests. We have a lot of old friends here tonight, including David and Marion Ellis. David was my predecessor. And also we have a lot of new friends. I would like also to thank the selection committee, and I would like them to stand, including Henry Beckton, the chair of the committee, for selecting such a distinguished guest and honoree. Thank you. Also, I would like to thank very much all of you that supported the event by purchasing tables and the special guest hosts, and all the friends of the museum who helped us establish this award that will enables us to invite distinguished guests from all over the world, like David, to address us. One last thing before dinner, I want to remind us that we are in a transformation for the museum with our 4 initiatives leading us to create the Technology Center for the 21st century. First, by reinforcing and underwriting our long-standing mission, by illuminating the revolution in the natural and life sciences, by advancing technological literacy nationwide, and I would say internationally also. Our newest partner in including engineering into their curriculum is actually your hometown, Alberta, in British Columbia now, are considering using our engineering curriculum that we develop here at the museum through our National Center for Technological Literacy, and renovating and expanding our physical presence. We are proud of our important role in the Boston community and our growing national and international importance in the teaching of science and technology. And we're very happy you're all here with us tonight, and our volunteers will lead you to the dinner area tonight. Thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of the evening.